I noticed it first because the frogs were gone. Every spring, right around the time the cottonwoods budded, the creek behind my property came alive. Frogs, dragonflies, minnows flashing like quicksilver in the shallows. It wasn't a big creek, more like a stubborn ribbon of water that had carved its way through the land long before any surveyor drew straight lines on a map, but it was mine, deeded and documented, flowing diagonally across the back 40 before slipping under an old culvert and continuing downhill. That morning, the water was silent. I stood at the bank, boots sinking slightly into the mud, staring at a gray wall where the current should have been moving. Concrete. Fresh. Still pale, with rough edges and fingerprints frozen in place like a bad decision preserved in stone. Someone had poured a dam straight across my creek. I didn't need a detective to tell me who. Uphill from my land sat the new HOA development, Bright Meadow Estates, according to the cheerful sign out front. Identical houses, identical mailboxes, identical rules. They'd arrived 2 years earlier with bulldozers and clipboards, flattening the hill and promising nature-inspired living, while cutting down everything older than 10 years. The creek ran through their stormwater plan, or at least it was supposed to. I climbed the embankment and followed the concrete upstream. It didn't take long to see the rest of it. They hadn't just blocked the creek, they'd redirected it. A wide slab funneled the water sideways into a shallow retention basin behind the last row of houses. It was neat, intentional, and completely illegal. I pulled out my phone and took pictures. Wide shots. Close-ups. The property markers. The stamped HOA logo still visible on a discarded form board. Then I did something that would later make the board members very, very nervous. I made no phone calls at all. See, I'd learned a long time ago that people who think they can pour concrete onto someone else's land don't listen to angry neighbors. They listen to inspectors, regulators, agencies with clipboards sharper than any argument. And water? Water is paperwork's favorite subject. For the next week, I watched. Without the creek flowing freely, the water began to back up. At first, it was subtle, a wider pool here, soggier grass there. Then the soil near the dam turned dark and spongy. The water had nowhere to go, and gravity doesn't care about HOA bylaws. Up the hill, Bright Meadow Estates started having issues. Lawns that wouldn't dry. Sump pumps running non-stop. A faint smell that no amount of mulch could hide. The retention basin overflowed during a mild rain, sending water creeping toward back patios like an uninvited guest. That's when the HOA sent me a letter. It was polite in the way only a lawyer-approved template can be. They claimed the concrete structure was part of an approved drainage improvement and suggested that any concerns should be routed through the proper channels, which, conveniently, did not include removing the blockage. I smiled, folded the letter, and added it to a growing folder. Then I made one call. Actually, 3. The County Water Resources Department, Environmental Protection, and the State Wetlands Office. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't accuse. I simply reported that a natural waterway on my property had been obstructed without my consent, and that upstream development appeared to be experiencing standing water as a result. Inspections move slowly, until they don't. 10 days later, white trucks lined the street at Bright Meadow Estates. Men and women in reflective vests walked the retention basin, boots squelching. Clipboards came out. Soil probes went in. Someone unrolled an old map that showed a thin blue line exactly where the concrete dam now sat. I watched from my fence as the HOA president gestured wildly, pointing downhill. At me. One inspector nodded, wrote something down, and then walked the length of my creek. By the end of the afternoon, red flags marked the area. Not the metaphorical kind, the real ones. Here's the thing about wetlands. They don't need permission to exist. Once water sits long enough, once the soil saturates and the right plants start showing up, the land changes classification. Permanently. And when that happens, rules multiply like mosquitoes. The inspectors came back after the next rain. Then again the week after that. By the third visit, they weren't asking questions. They were issuing notices. The retention basin? No longer a basin. It now met the criteria for a protected wetland due to altered hydrology. The saturated lawns behind 6 houses? Encroachment zone. Any disturbance would require permits that took months, sometimes years. All because someone thought pouring concrete across my creek was faster than doing things the right way. I finally received another letter from the HOA. This one wasn't polite. It asked, no, demanded, that I cooperate in resolving the situation by granting access and acknowledging the drainage modification. I looked out at the waterlogged slope, the cattails already poking through where grass used to be, and the inspector's flags fluttering like warnings. Then I set the letter down. The creek had flowed here longer than Bright Meadow Estates had existed. And now, thanks to one careless decision, their neighborhood was learning exactly what happens when you try to tell water where it's allowed to go. The HOA's second letter arrived by certified mail. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Gone was the stiff confidence of approved drainage improvement. In its place was urgency, phrases like time-sensitive, mutual cooperation, and my personal favorite, to avoid further regulatory complications. When people start talking like that, it means the fines clock has started ticking. I didn't sign for it right away. Let it sit at the post office for 3 days. Water doesn't rush, and neither do I. While the envelope waited, the creek did what creeks do when they've been wronged. It kept spreading. The shallow pool behind the concrete dam expanded after every rain, soaking into the soil like ink into blotting paper. The ground softened, then gave. A young willow near the bank tilted at an angle that said it would never be straight again. Uphill, Bright Meadow Estates was losing its manicured look. Homeowners posted photos in the neighborhood group chat, screenshots I was later shown by a sympathetic contractor. Backyards that squished underfoot. Patio pavers sinking unevenly. One resident complained that her dog came back from the yard smelling like a swamp. She wasn't wrong. When I finally picked up the letter, I opened it at my kitchen table, next to the folder I'd labeled Simply Creek. Inside were copies of my photos, annotated with arrows and notes, as if highlighting the blockage somehow made it less illegal. They wanted a meeting. I agreed on one condition. It would be on-site at the creek. The HOA board showed up the following Saturday in clean boots and worried expressions. The president, same man I'd seen gesturing at the inspectors, stepped carefully around the mud, grimacing as his heels sank deeper than expected. This is all a misunderstanding, he began. I let him talk. People reveal more when you don't interrupt. According to him, the developer had installed the concrete structure, temporarily, during construction. According to him, it was never meant to alter the creek's flow. According to him, the retention basin was engineered to handle runoff, and any saturation was unrelated seasonal moisture. I pointed to the cattails. Seasonal moisture doesn't grow those, I said. One of the board members, a woman clutching a clipboard like a life raft, asked if I'd consider signing an easement retroactively. It would, she said, simplify the permitting process. There it was. The real ask. I told them I'd think about it. What I didn't tell them was that the inspectors had already made their determination. 2 days later, a formal notice was posted at the edge of the retention basin. Potential jurisdictional wetland. Do not disturb. Bright orange. Impossible to miss. That sign changed everything. Land that might have been inconvenient was now radioactive. No digging. No draining. No fixing, without approvals that required environmental studies, public comment, and mitigation plans that cost more than some of the houses themselves. The HOA's legal counsel got involved. Then their insurer. Then, quietly, the developer's old engineering firm, who wanted very badly to prove this wasn't their fault. I received a call from an attorney whose voice suggested he billed by the breath. He asked if I'd experienced any damages. I looked out the window at my soggy pasture and answered honestly, not yet. That was the wrong answer for him, because without damages to claim, there was nothing to settle quickly. And without a quick settlement, the agencies stayed involved. Every rain event added data. Every week of standing water strengthened the wetland classification. The homeowners started to panic. One couple tried to sell. The disclosure form flagged environmental constraints. Their buyer walked. Another resident tore out a strip of lawn to regrade, without permission, and was fined by the county before the sod even arrived. The HOA sent one more letter, this one practically pleading. They offered to remove the concrete dam immediately if I'd support a finding that no wetland had been intentionally created. I read that line twice. Intentionally. I replied with a single sentence, I will not make statements that contradict observable conditions. After the next storm, the basin overflowed again. Water pooled behind 3 garages. The county returned, this time with a biologist. She knelt, examined the soil, and smiled the kind of smile that ends arguments. Hydric soils, she said. Established. That word, established, hit the HOA like a hammer. By the end of the month, Bright Meadow Estates had a new label in the county database. Not just a development with drainage issues, but a site with regulated wetland areas and buffer zones. All because someone thought concrete was a shortcut. As for the creek, it waited. Blocked, yes, but patient. And water, when given time, always finds a way to make its case. The day the county updated its maps, everything shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no sirens, no announcements. Just a quiet revision in a digital database that most people never think about. A few keystrokes, a new shaded area, a note in the margin. But when that map changed, Bright Meadow Estates stopped being just a neighborhood with a drainage problem. It became a neighborhood with restrictions. I found out because the HOA president called me at dawn. Not to argue. Not to threaten. To ask. They reclassified the basin, he said, his voice tight. And the backlots. How many? I asked. There was a pause. 12. Possibly more if the buffer expands. 12 homes suddenly sat next to, or partially within, a regulated wetland buffer. That meant no fences without permits. No sheds. No patios. No grading. In some cases, no replacement of existing structures without environmental review. And worst of all, for an HOA built on uniformity, no guarantees. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. Homeowners packed the clubhouse, tempers flaring, fingers pointing. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. By then, everyone knew the story. Someone had blocked the creek. Someone had done it without permission. And now the water had rewritten the rules. The developer's engineering firm finally broke silence. They submitted documents claiming the concrete structure was a temporary erosion control measure that had been misinterpreted as a permanent dam. The inspectors were unimpressed. Temporary measures don't cure in place. Temporary measures don't reroute natural flow. And temporary measures certainly don't sit on land that doesn't belong to you. A removal order was issued. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because removing the concrete didn't erase what had already happened. The soil remained saturated. The plants remained. The classification remained. Wetlands don't disappear just because you apologize. When the contractor jackhammered the slab apart, the creek surged forward like it had been holding its breath. Water rushed downhill, carving new channels through soil that had softened over weeks. The sudden movement triggered erosion alarms, and work was halted halfway through. More inspectors. More flags. More paperwork. At that point, the HOA tried a different angle. They sent me a proposal. A generous one, by most standards. Compensation for access. Funds for creek stabilization. A promise to restore my land to pre-incident condition. I read it carefully. Nowhere did it acknowledge fault. Nowhere did it mention that the wetland existed because of their actions. And nowhere did it guarantee that future maintenance wouldn't require crossing my property again. I declined. Politely. Firmly. The consequences rippled outward. Property values dipped. Listings sat longer. One lender required additional environmental disclosures before approving mortgages on the affected lots. Insurance premiums crept up. And the HOA? They started enforcing rules harder than ever, cracking down on minor violations in a desperate attempt to assert control somewhere, anywhere. It only made things worse. Then came the final blow. The state issued its determination. Based on duration of saturation, presence of hydrophytic vegetation, and altered hydrology caused by unauthorized obstruction, the wetland designation was upheld. Restoration would require a multi-year mitigation plan, and even then, full reclassification was not guaranteed. In plain language, this wasn't going away. The HOA president came to see me one last time. He looked tired, older than he had a month before. "We should have talked to you first," he said. "Yes," I replied. He stared at the creek, now flowing freely again, clear and cold, as if nothing had ever been wrong. "I thought we were improving things," he said. "That's the problem," I answered. "You didn't ask the land." He nodded, slowly. When he left, I walked down to the bank. The frogs had returned. Dragonflies skimmed the surface. The water moved the way it always had, indifferent to paperwork and politics. Bright Meadow Estates would adapt. Or it wouldn't. That wasn't my concern. The map had changed. And once water redraws the lines, there's no going back. Once the wetland designation became official, the tone inside Bright Meadow Estates changed from panic to fracture. People stopped arguing about what happened and started fighting over who would pay. The HOA board tried to project calm. They sent weekly emails filled with phrases like working closely with regulators and long-term environmental stewardship. But behind closed doors, the meetings stretched late into the night, voices raised, lawyers on speakerphone, spreadsheets glowing like bad omens. The first special assessment notice went out 2 weeks later. It wasn't labeled as such, not yet. It was called a temporary environmental compliance contribution. 5 figures, split across the neighborhood. Due in 60 days. That's when the lawsuits began. Homeowners sued the HOA. The HOA threatened the developer. The developer pointed at the engineering firm. The engineering firm quietly produced emails warning about unauthorized modifications that no one had wanted to delay construction over. Everyone had a paper trail. No one wanted ownership. Meanwhile, the wetland did not care. The buffer zones expanded slightly after another series of spring storms. The biologist returned, flagged additional areas, and explained, patiently for the 3rd time, that once an ecosystem establishes itself, it must be protected from disturbance, not negotiated with. One homeowner tried anyway. He rented a pump, ran hoses overnight, and attempted to lower the water level behind his fence. By morning, county enforcement was there. The fine was steep. The pump was confiscated. The warning letter cited willful interference with a regulated wetland. That phrase spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Willful interference. Suddenly, people were afraid to mow too close to the water. The HOA board, under mounting pressure, made a decision they thought would finally regain control. They voted to sue me. The claim was carefully worded. They alleged that my refusal to cooperate had exacerbated the situation. That had I granted an easement earlier, the wetland might have been avoided. That my actions, or lack thereof, had caused financial harm. I wasn't surprised. I also wasn't worried. My attorney filed a response that consisted mostly of exhibits. Deeds. Survey maps. Time-stamped photos. Copies of their own letters claiming the concrete structure was approved. Inspection reports clearly stating the obstruction was unauthorized. Most damaging of all was the county's timeline. It showed that the wetland conditions developed before I was ever contacted, before any request for cooperation, and entirely as a result of the blocked creek. The judge didn't dismiss the case immediately. He scheduled a hearing. That hearing became the moment Bright Meadow Estates truly unraveled. Residents attended in numbers, sitting stiffly behind their board, listening as their own documents were read aloud. Emails about pouring now and asking later. Notes about how rerouting the creek would be cheaper than redesigning. The judge asked a single question that hung in the room like fog. Why was the property owner not consulted before altering a natural waterway on his land? No one answered. After that, the lawsuit limped along for a few weeks before the HOA quietly withdrew it. The legal fees alone were becoming unbearable, and their insurer had started asking uncomfortable questions about disclosure and risk management. The board president resigned. Then the treasurer. An emergency election was called, but no one wanted the seats. Control, it turned out, was expensive when it failed. Throughout all of this, I stayed where I had always been. Watching. The creek settled back into its channel. The newly formed wetland stabilized, ringed by reeds and soft grasses. Birds nested where there had once been sod. The land adjusted as land always does. One afternoon, a county planner stopped by my fence. "You know," she said, looking uphill, "this will probably become a permanent conservation area. It actually improves flood resilience downstream." I nodded. She smiled. "Not the outcome they wanted." "No," I said, "but maybe the one they needed." By summer's end, Bright Meadow Estates had changed its marketing language. No more nature-inspired living. Now it was adjacent to protected open space. A careful spin on a hard lesson. For me, the lesson had always been simple. You can manage people with rules. You can manage land with respect. But the moment you try to control water without understanding it, it starts keeping score. And water never forgets. By autumn, the panic had burned itself out. What remained in Bright Meadow Estates was something quieter and heavier, acceptance, edged with regret. The wetland wasn't expanding anymore. It didn't need to. It had claimed its space and settled in, a living boundary no committee vote could undo. The new HOA board was smaller, humbler. Their emails lost their corporate polish and started sounding human. Fewer declarations. More apologies, though never the kind that admitted fault outright. They stopped sending me letters altogether. That didn't mean the consequences stopped. The special assessment became official. Larger than the first hint had suggested. Some homeowners paid without comment. Others couldn't. For sale signs multiplied, and this time they stayed up longer. Buyers asked questions. Inspectors pointed. Realtors chose their words carefully. Environmentally complex became the phrase of the season. One evening, a couple from the neighborhood walked down to my fence. Middle-aged, tired-looking, not angry, just worn. "We didn't vote for any of this," the man said. "We just bought a house." I believed him. "I know," I said. They asked if I'd consider allowing a footpath near the creek so residents could enjoy the view of the wetland. I shook my head. "It's not a feature," I said. "It's a consequence." They nodded, thanked me anyway, and walked back uphill. The state finalized its mitigation requirements before winter. Native planting. Long-term monitoring. Prohibitions on future modifications. A conservation easement recorded against certain lots, binding not just current owners, but every owner who would come after. Paper that lasted longer than concrete. The developer settled with the HOA quietly. Numbers were never shared publicly, but the change was visible. The clubhouse renovation was canceled. Landscaping budgets were cut. The board stopped talking about upgrades and started talking about reserves. On my side of the creek, things improved. With the obstruction gone, my land dried properly. The pasture recovered. The creek ran clear, carving gently where it always had. I planted willows where the bank had slumped and watched them take hold, roots stitching soil together better than any poured barrier ever could. In late October, I received one last communication from the HOA. Not a demand. Not a threat. A notice. They were formally designating the wetland edge as a no-contact boundary and recording that future boards were prohibited from altering drainage patterns without landowner consent and regulatory approval. It was, in its way, an admission. I filed it away and closed the folder labeled Creek. The story didn't end with a dramatic victory or a courtroom speech. It ended the way most real conflicts do, with limits set, lessons learned too late, and a quiet understanding of where authority actually lies. Water had drawn the line, and everyone else had to live with it. On the first cold morning of November, frost traced the edges of the wetland. The grasses bowed under its weight. A heron stood motionless in the shallows, patient as stone. I watched from the bank and thought about how close the neighborhood had come to a different outcome. If they'd asked, if they'd listened, if they'd respected the creek instead of trying to tame it. But control is tempting, especially when it comes with bylaws and budgets and the illusion of permanence. Nature has no interest in illusions. The HOA learned that the hard way. As for me, I learned something too, something I'd known, but never seen proven so clearly. You don't have to fight every battle. Sometimes, you just have to let the water speak. Winter came early that year. The first hard freeze locked the wetland in glass, reeds rimmed with ice, the surface reflecting the pale sky like a held breath. From my porch, the creek looked unchanged, narrow, steady, moving the way it always had. But uphill, the land told a different story. Bright Meadow Estates was quieter now. Fewer lights in the evenings. Fewer cars and driveways. The neighborhood hadn't emptied, but it had thinned, like a crowd after a long argument finally runs out of things to say. The new HOA board tried to make peace with the land instead of fighting it. They invited conservation consultants. They installed signage explaining the wetland's purpose, framing it as an asset rather than a mistake. Children were warned not to wander too close. Adults learned where the invisible lines were. Boundaries, once written only in bylaws, were now written in soil and water. One afternoon, the former HOA president stopped by unannounced. He didn't step onto my property. Just stood at the fence, hands in his pockets, staring downhill. "I drive past creeks differently now," he said. I nodded. He apologized then, not as a representative, not with legal phrasing, but as a person. For assuming, for rushing, for believing concrete could fix something that needed patience instead. "I thought rules were enough," he said. "They usually are," I replied, "until they meet something older." He left without asking for anything. That mattered. By spring, life returned in layers. Frogs again. Birds I hadn't seen before. The wetland hummed with quiet activity, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, holding water during storms, releasing it slowly, protecting everything downstream from sudden force. The county placed a small marker near the basin, protected wetland, established by natural hydrology. Not a monument, just a fact. Real estate listings adjusted their language again. The wetland became part of the identity of Bright Meadow Estates, no longer a flaw but a feature to work around. New buyers came in informed, cautious, and oddly appreciative of the open space that could never be built over. The land had corrected the narrative. As for the creek, it flowed on, unconcerned with chapters or conclusions. It didn't care that it had been blocked, labeled, inspected, argued over. It remembered none of that. But the land around it did. It remembered the weeks of standing water, the altered paths, the plants that had taken root in new places. Memory in land isn't about resentment, it's about structure. Once changed, it shapes everything that comes after. Late one evening, I walked the length of the creek as the sun dipped low. The water caught the light and broke it into fragments. I thought about how easily this could have gone another way, how a single conversation, a single pause, could have spared an entire neighborhood years of cost and stress. But that's not how these stories usually go. They go the way this one did. With someone deciding faster is better. Cheaper is smarter. That land is something you can correct instead of consult. The HOA learned. The residents learned. And maybe, quietly, the next development uphill would learn too, when they saw the shaded area on the map and asked why it was there. The answer would be simple. Because water was ignored once. I stopped at the old dam site. The concrete was gone, but a faint line remained where it had pressed into the soil. Grass grew differently there, shorter, tougher. Scars don't always disappear. They just become part of the terrain. I turned back toward the house as night settled in. Behind me, the creek kept moving, steady and sure, carrying nothing but itself. That's the thing about land. It doesn't argue. It doesn't threaten. It just remembers and adjusts the future accordingly. Years later, people would forget the details. They wouldn't remember the concrete, or the hearings, or the emergency meetings that ran past midnight. They wouldn't remember how close Bright Meadow Estates came to tearing itself apart over something as quiet as water. What they would remember, if they noticed at all, was the line. The line where the lawns stopped. The line where the ground dipped and softened, where grasses grew taller and birds gathered in the mornings. The place no one built on, no one fenced, no one argued about anymore. The wetland became normal. Children grew up with it as part of the landscape. They learned not to throw rocks into the water because it scared the frogs. They learned which paths stayed dry after rain and which ones didn't. Teenagers took photos there at sunset. Couples walked the edge of it, careful without quite knowing why. Rules written on signs faded. Rules written into the land did not. The HOA still existed, of course. They always do. They collected dues, argued about paint colors, sent reminders about trash bins. But something fundamental had shifted. Whenever a question came up about drainage, grading, or just a small change, someone would inevitably say, "Remember the creek?" And that was enough. Upstream, a new developer once floated an idea for expanding the retention system. It died in the planning phase when the maps came out and the shaded area appeared. No one wanted to be the reason that line moved again. On my property, life stayed simple. The creek never flooded the way people fear water will. It did exactly what it was meant to do: carry storms gently downhill, slow when it needed to, move when it could. The wetland took the excess and gave it back in its own time. Balance, restored not by design, but by allowance. Occasionally, someone from the neighborhood would stop at my fence and ask about it. Not to challenge. Just curiosity. Was it really that bad? They'd ask. It was, I'd say. Because no one was listening. Listening is the part most people miss. They think land is silent because it doesn't speak their language. But land communicates constantly through saturation, erosion, growth, collapse. Every change is a sentence. Every consequence a paragraph. Bright Meadow Estates learned to read. So did I, in a way. I learned that you don't always need to raise your voice to be heard. You don't need to threaten or demand or even win. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is step back and let reality proceed uninterrupted. The concrete was gone. The paperwork was filed. The lawsuits were long closed. What remained was a place that would outlast all of it. One spring morning, long after the inspectors had moved on and the signs had weathered, I watched the creek swell with snowmelt. It rose, spread into the wetland, slowed and settled. No damage. No panic. Just movement within limits that made sense. That's when it occurred to me that this was the real outcome. Not punishment, not revenge, not even justice. It was alignment. The land was doing what it always wanted to do. The people around it had finally stopped trying to stop it. Bright Meadow Estates still stood on the hill. Houses weathered. Families came and went. The wetland stayed. So did the creek. And somewhere beneath the surface, beneath roots and water and time, the line held quiet, firm, and permanent. Not because anyone enforced it, but because it was finally respected.